My name is Idiot. That is my hacker handle. So I am a security researcher. I am active in breaking stuff, finding out how I break stuff, and then finding out how to repair it. I hope I could say I'm one of the good guys, but sometimes I run into breaking systems that were not expected, and I kind of make a really stupid face because I thought a system was secure, and then find out very quickly it wasn't. So then I scramble to find out and make sure that when I understand how I broke a system, then I can discuss and tell people how to lock these systems down. So I do security research on a lot of different things. I wanted to start off today with the basics of cyber analysis. I apologize if you've already done this before, but one of the more difficult things about discussions is you never really know who has what level of knowledge. So in order for us to go to the attack data later on, I hope it's okay that we talk about first what is my understanding of cyber analysis, what are the different components of that, and how do they drill down into the research that we do, right? Are there any security researchers in the audience, by the way? Awesome, cool. That's the reason why you asked me that question, right? So cyber analysis for me, breaking it down, and there's a lot of different things, is using forensic science to find evidence that shows indicators that leads to a threat actor that attacked a target by using an attack tool or a solution, right? Is it okay? Now I'm going through some things a little bit faster because I think this is basic. If I'm going too fast, then just tell me to slow down. If I break this down into a picture of different things that I do research on, there's different blocks that I look at. So there's social engineering, web applications, hardware hacking, next generation types of attacks, and there we have the crypto locker stuff. We've got data info interception, we've got application and cloud backdoors, and we have critical infrastructure and cyber warfare and espionage. If you guys want access to the slides later on, you can have them. If you publish any of the work, please just mention that you got it from me. I'd really appreciate that, right? So the reason why I do this is to pass on information and knowledge, have a discussion with everyone here, so this is not just me talking. We'll go through a few different questions and answers, and hopefully there'll be enough interaction with all of you folks here, because I'm happy when I've talked about something that's new for you guys and it's interesting, and if you ask questions, right? Okay, cool. So looking at the different types of threat silos, we also have the different other areas, which are the soft things that we can't really define in technology, which are the people, the processes, the software, types of devices, and then we have these hybrid next generation things that we're talking about, which ties into this too, right? Any questions on that? Yes, no? No. Okay. So I mentor a lot of folks, and I'm very privileged and honored to do that. So that's the reason why I figured it would make sense to talk about what is an ideal analyst, what kind of stuff do we do, and how does this fall into the research. So we use deduction to make conclusions, right? There's a lot of stuff going out there about fake news. People talk about, okay, well, this is my fact, but then my question is, okay, well, where are the facts? How can I link to the research that you've done? How did you come to a specific conclusion? And how can I verify your conclusion makes sense based on data, right? And I'll get to that later on, why that makes sense. Knows forensic science principles and uses them. So why are we talking about this? There's a lot of stuff, again, fake news. Different people are saying that researchers like me that do cyber espionage and warfare research to detect attacks that are going on, and when some of us say, okay, well, we found a specific attack and we attribute this, we think, to a nation state or threat actor, the reason why we say that to maybe around 60 to 80% is because we have evidence that supports that discussion, right? It's important for everyone in the industry, regardless of what level we have, to always discuss how we do the research and how we get to our conclusions, because there's a lot of people who disagree with our conclusions because they want to spread propaganda or some other type of false information. So the way we can work against that is by discussing how we come to a conclusion in the first place, right? So reading different reports, finding out what's really important, taking out the information, and some of these reports are like 50, 60 pages, and the actual information in these reports is only like 2 or 3 sentences, right? Who is the attacker? What tools did they use? Who was the target? Is it at a specific profile? How do we recognize it's a specific profile? And where's the evidence or data to support that conclusion, right? And then troubleshooting mentality. We always run into issues. What I mean by troubleshooting mentality is assume that you will always run into issues or problems somewhere. Adapt a checklist approach so that when you run into these problems, you go through things step by step to find out where the actual problem is, then you can resolve it, right? Okay, then another thing, when I did my studies back at Ulster University, I did my master's on trying to figure out what makes security teams successful. And one of the things that I learned through these assessments were security teams and people in security that are very good at their jobs and successful, they have a continuous learning mentality. We never stop learning because the types of threats are so dynamic that we always have to keep abreast of the new information technology that's going out there, right? So whether it's IoT, nuances of IoT, botnets that are using that, different types of infections that are looking at specific ports to communicate to then find out hard-coded passwords, which is kind of stupid, but that's just the way it is. And then using those systems to include them into a botnet to then do DNS, DDoS and other types of interesting attacks. Last thing is people that are in leadership positions, they tend to be more transformational. So transformational just means since we're in a dynamic space, things are constantly evolving and changing. The classical ways of leadership don't apply to the work that we do in security, right? So if you know this, if you understand this, and you're leading a whole bunch of security researchers, rule number one is keep your ego outside, right? And I apologize if this is common sense, I just wanted to say that one more time. Let the people do their jobs, foster an environment of continuous learning and also an open team so that people can share their knowledge with each other and you can detect and find things out a lot faster and easier, right? In regards to cyber analysis or the analyst, it's important to understand what the chain of events are that lead to specific exploits and attacks. So the cyber kill chain, which is not something I created, this was Lockheed Martin that came up with this. And when we take a look at the attack data that we find on a daily basis, we can find every one of these areas in the details of the attack to find out exactly what the person was doing, right? So for instance, reconnaissance, about 85 to 90% of any hack or attack revolves around the appropriate type of information, right? What kind of targets am I going to have? What kind of information do I have? What kind of company is it? What kind of employees do they have? What email services did they use? What applications do they use? As many details as possible to get to the stage where I can then choose what type of weapon can I use to break into the system, what delivery system do I use to pass on the infection, what exploitations do I use that are based off of reconnaissance, how do I install these specific snippets of code, what kind of command and control infrastructure do I use, whether it's a social botnet or a classical botnet, and then what are the objectives that I want to achieve with this specific attack. So we just went through that. I'm not going to go through this too much. Later on when you read the slides, this could be interesting because we had a discussion before when you were talking about trolls, this kind of stuff, right? One of the biggest issues that we have in security research is a lot of the data that we have today points to cybercrime, when in reality, most people that do security research forget that we also have cyber warfare and cyber espionage. So when we do our reconnaissance and data on what the attack was, who was the target, more often than not, you have to spend an ample amount of time to figure out if this technology was from somewhere else, right? So some information about me, I've worked on both sides of the fence. I've worked in lawful interception, so going after terrorists, cyber terrorism, that kind of stuff. And I've also locked down systems to protect them against terrorists and also attackers, right? So when you have an understanding of that, you can appreciate that certain types of cyber weapons that are released into the environment, they get reverse engineered and turn into the next types of cyber attacks, right? So if this technology that was originally used for espionage and groups that really have time and patience and money to do these things, the types of attacks that come out and the technology that are used is a lot different than the old cyber crime attacks that we used to deal with, right? Back a few years ago, antivirus was enough. Today, it's hopeless, right? It just doesn't work anymore because the types of attacks that we're facing are actually based off of cyber espionage and cyber warfare, right? So, and there's some more details about this when you read through the slides, what different types of threats, so APTs, botnets, DDoS, that kind of stuff. A lot of that is classical cyber crime, but now the boundaries between what is cyber crime, what is cyber espionage and warfare are very, very thin, right? So when we take a look at data, it's cyber crime, but is it really cyber crime? Just saying basically to ask that question, do we really think it's cyber crime, or do we think it could be something different, right? So then after that, creating what we call indicators of compromise. So how do I detect if something's going to infect my system? What are the things around there? Come to the conclusions, recommendations, and then write about the technical details, and then bibliography, journals, evidence. That's the basic part. Now I'm going to get into why you guys are really here, right? So I did research back in 2014 and 2015 on operations of a specific nation state that initiated infections before an election. Sound similar? This election was not in 2016, it was in 2015, and the country where this election took place was the Ukraine. So during the time of this, this specific attack, we found that information was being compiled and attacks were being compiled in something that at that point in time we didn't know if it was a campaign or if it was something organized. So here's the timeline of some of the attacks that we had, and I know some of this is controversial, but I'll say my assumptions, right? And you can get the slides later on, so you can get really nice pictures of that. So it started off with the media industry. This was the first attack that we saw, and I found this by accident. A customer called us up and said, hey, Mike, you know, something's going on in our system. We don't know really why. Can you take a look at the systems? And we did research, the stuff that I just talked about, cyber analysis or analysis in general, and we got to the conclusion that we were looking at a massive infection, right? So this massive infection targeted a specific industry, and the way the attacks came in were also targeted, which led us to the conclusion that this was not some typical type of cybercrime attack that we were looking at, right? While we released the information and passed it on to the Ukraine authorities, to CERT, and to everyone else, we never got an answer back. And then about a few weeks later, the next attack happened. So when I talked to different folks about this attack, I told them it was a POC, it was a proof of concept, it was a modular-based code that was used. So they used Black Energy 2, they rehashed it, added new functionality, new modules, and turned it into a new version, Black Energy 3, right? So I told them back then I was concerned because it looked like a very targeted campaign throughout an entire industry. It wasn't just one company, it was the entire industry, media, right? So there's details of that attack on Hack 4 and Berlin Sides. I had some discussions on that before last year and the year before, so you can get more details on that. After that attack happened, the power grid got targeted, right? So here we were looking at a combination of infection variants that used email through VPN connections that were targeted, that then basically infected SCADA systems on the power grid. And this happened twice, right? So the first time, around 300,000 houses were left without energy. And that was, I believe, in the cold time, around winter time, right? Around end of November, beginning of December, that was, in 2015, I believe. So there were similarities to the attack, but there were some differences, and it wasn't conclusive if it was the same threat actor. I believed it was, because I saw certain types of code that looked very similar, but some of the attack vectors that they used were slightly different, just different enough to not let you say, okay, well, this is probably cyber Berkroot, etc., right? Then after that, another few weeks later, the Kiev airport was taken offline, and critical systems were also infected. The goal there was also to cause disruptions. Similarities in the other two attacks and some differences, right? Then the power grid again was attacked. And then we had European attacks like the metal industry, other different types of attacks on energy and on other companies that were defensive near, which then led to a specific timeline of attacks that we think are from a specific nation, right? So while this happened, then I also started to see a new attack, which was pretty interesting for me. And I said back then, I see similarities from the last election in the media industry, and I see some similarities in this one. So here we had a combination of released and dumped information and also intrusion attempts into DNC servers and the Clinton servers. I don't have to talk about that in detail. You guys know more than enough about that, right? But if anyone says on social media that they don't think it was a specific person, it's BS. The signs, if you look into the data, are there. The likelihood of it being the same person that did that is very, very high, right? I can never say 100% because none of us can, but the likelihood is pretty high that it was the same person that did the attacks on the other election, right? What we also started to see here was social media tampering, what I call social media tampering. And this was the widespread use of botnets to disseminate information into Twitter initially, then Facebook, Instagram, all the different types of social media services, which were a targeted campaign to make a specific person look bad, right? So whether it was WikiLeaks, WikiParty, that spread out into various different other accounts, and it was interesting. Right? If I take a look at some of the details on some of the attacks, these were some of the vulnerabilities that we found that they used to break into the systems. So weak VPN rules and a compromised client. There were weak firewall rules that didn't actually inspect the traffic, check it, and block. Also internally to the supervisory network, when we're talking about the power grid stuff, weak firewall rules. We also had a lack of network access controls, various different backdoors in systems, and also weak passwords, right? In case anyone's interested in the vulnerabilities that we found. So for the electrical pieces, if we take a look at the way their networks are built up, we have multiple layers. So we have the VPN, then the business LAN, then the supervisory network, and then the control systems. And this is where you can see different types of areas where different types of attacks can happen and did happen in those attacks. So one of the conclusions of that research was, okay, classical vectors of targeting a VPN user with a very well-crafted phishing email was the initial way into the network, looked like legitimate government correspondence. Malware was dormant until just before the elections, then the magic started. If elections were disrupted, would this happen again and to the US or Germany? And I asked this question back in 2015, right? So I think the answer now is pretty clear, right? So some of the conclusions that we had, and we passed this on, we found that it's reasonable to assume, since this was a proof of concept, that it would happen again. And some of the information that we collected later on social media botnets and other pwned accounts led to me believing that it is probably the same organizer, right? And I'm just saying 100% IDing a target is very, very difficult at best. So after these attacks, then the question was, well, what are these guys up to now? Nobody laughs at my pictures. You know how long it took me to get these pictures? And I was laughing when I was putting this in because I thought, there's actually guys that do this. But so Fancy Bear, right? Fancy Bear and all these cool names that they call these different espionage areas. So I asked myself the question back in 2016, the beginning of 2016. Okay, so there was an initial attack, toolkit got updated, and there were more goodies put into this toolkit. They have to be using it for something else because otherwise the time that they invested in testing in Ukraine to see how successful the attack was, and also coordinating sub-attacks after that, there had to be a reason for this, right? So after that, the campaign, it produced more attacks on various different critical infrastructure areas. The Ukrainian election disruptions showed us that a nation state could disrupt elections at a local and national level by targeting specific industries. Kind of scary, huh? And this was before 2016. This was back in 2015. So as 2016 was going on, then we started seeing releases of voter data, social security numbers, personal information like license cards or license permits that were being dumped on the darknet, right? And then doing some more research into how voting machines are still vulnerable. And then the question was, okay, well, are they going to target elections in the US? Is this a reality or not? And the conclusion was, it was a reality. There's different ways that you can use this and different things that you could do. So we discussed in the update that the initial infection and disruption in Ukraine was only a POC. When November 8 came closer, I saw more and more of these unrelated account breaches, like the voter registration information, like the license IDs, etc. I started to see a trend, right? So can anyone help me out? Why is voter registration, social security number, and a driver license, why is that important for an election? Anyone?
Are those the kind of things that you need to present when you're giving your vote?
Right. So those are the things that I use to identify and authenticate who I am, right? If I'm not using a biometric system, then obviously it's going to be a bit more difficult. But if I'm not using biometric systems for voter registration, etc., then I can impersonate someone else. Interesting, huh? And we found databases, voter registration databases for almost all 50 plus states. And we found licenses. I have screenshots of some darknet stuff later on as well, if anyone's interested, just to show you this stuff was actually out there. So we saw that. We saw that the voter registration databases got pwned and leaked. They were being sold. Social security numbers were being leaked and they were in the darknet. And then there were also the driver licenses, right? So was there a trend? I believe there was a trend, right? So, and then lastly, taking all this information into account with the voting machines. Some of the voting machines, and there's research out there that's basically said some of these weren't patched in more than 2 years. Right, so whoever knows anything about patch management is important, because if you have an operating system or an application that's inherently not secure and you don't patch them, then it's not a good thing, right? So patches help you increase the level of security. Doing it is trivial as long as you have a system to do that. So all these things started to add up, right? So then we get back to botnets and fancy bears. What I then started to notice was about 2-3 months before the elections, Twitter users started to appear from nowhere, from thin air, right? And this goes back to some of the stuff that you talked about. The interesting thing was some of the traits were very often the very acidic or the very radical accounts. They had similarities, right? So there were interesting traits that users spammed and hate posted anyone that said something against Trump, right? And they pushed out a lot of information about pro-candidate, right? Which was interesting. If it was a hacker, you'd post stuff for, excuse my French, shits and giggles for both sides. You make both look stupid. But in this instance, it didn't look like it was a typical hacker because there was only information from one side. And it looked like it was organized. And when I say accounts appearing, we're talking about thousands of accounts within the space of 1-2 days, right? So the reason why this is important is there are solutions out there in lawful interception that are sold to basically create your own botnet on social media. You can literally say, create these accounts on this date, these many accounts. Here are the standard tweets that you can tweet once you have these accounts. Attach these accounts to my other sub-accounts as friends to make them look normal. Interesting. And this stuff is out there. It's not new. It's been out there for years. So, and then I wanted to take a look at, with all this stuff going on, was it the same people that were doing this stuff in Ukraine? So then I started doing some analysis on what were some of the hashtags that these cluster of users were using, right? So in this case, okay, accounts cropped up left and right. They appeared as women. They appeared as veterans. Because if you have these different types of accounts, you're not going to attack them. A guy's not going to attack a woman because you don't do that, right? It's chivalry. And also people don't attack vets because we have a lot of respect for people that have served the country. I think that's pretty much in every country. The interesting thing was they used these account types to stop people from questioning the information they were posting. System. Interesting system. Then, on further analysis, MAGA, Does anyone know what MAGA means? Anyone on Twitter? Yes? Come on, I know most of you are on Twitter. Yeah, exactly. A lot of these different accounts in the clusters, they had the same hashtags, I'm with Israel, MAGA, etc. And they posted a lot of stuff that we call this shit posting. So posting that's basically, oh, well, this candidate is fantastic, the other one's crap, and they're doing this, this, and that. They're doing illegal stuff and this, and they should be thrown in jail, etc. Any similarities that you guys have seen, right? And then they attacked anyone that had anything to say against a specific candidate. And then when I started publishing this information, I started seeing attacks from Russia, Vietnam, China, US, etc. Interesting. Right? So when you started doing your stuff for the journalism, I did the same thing for the research that we were finding on social botnets. And the attacks on the website increased after the first day of posting this research and information. Interesting, huh? So some of the clusters there, some of the words, we actually did the analysis. So then drill down into, cool picture, right? Laugh, come on, I know you guys don't laugh that much, but it takes a lot of work to get these pictures, you know? So, and that's not me, by the way. I think I look a lot better. I shaved, right? So the observation in Twitter was, after months of fighting, I just got smarter. I figured there's got to be a system, there's something behind this, it stinks. So I started using Python to monitor attackers, their timelines, and I wanted to build a picture, their timeline, the friends, the followers. And could I link these attacks back to Russia? And I could. Yeah.
Think you can explain what is Fancy Bear?
Fancy Bear is my name for, what was it? There was an espionage, or was it Fancy Bears it was. It was an operation that was termed for the APT, I believe it was 28 and 32 groups. So Fancy Bear was basically an espionage campaign that was targeting critical infrastructure on different countries. And some of the targeting of that also went out into social media. Right, so that's, if you take a look at some of the research reports out there, they term that, I believe Fancy Bear was the term that they used. I called it Fancy Schmancy Bear because I found some more stuff, right? So researchers have weird names for operations, right? I don't know if it's the real operation name in Russia. They probably call it something different, like Pro-Trump or Let's Get 'Em or whatever. But that's the way researchers tend to have weird names for this. So my name for this was Fancy Schmancy Bears. And I shortened it down to Fancy Bear, right? Okay, because this was an operation, right? It was a cool name, huh? That's why I have all the bears. Yeah, I know, I'm a geek, I'm sorry. I said I can't tell jokes, so. So then I started taking a look into more details. Here are the hashtags a little bit better. So what this basically means is I used neural networks to map the different types of Twitter users. I took a look at their followers, I took a look at the hashtags that they had, I took a look at their tweets, and started to make an analysis of where the clusters are, right? So for clustering, does anyone take any courses in data science? Yes, no? Yeah? Classifier is, what do we use classifiers for? What? Right, so how do we classify? How do we classify things? Right. Correct. For instance, Bayesian algorithms could be used for that, or naive Bayes, for instance, could be used for that classifier. Another type of classification algorithm would be neural networks, but they have the component of learning based on the results that come back, and they can redefine those and tweak them, right? So this is just basically mathematics and probabilistic type of analysis. So what is the probability of when people tweet this that they are bots, yes or no? When people tweet these things, what is the probability that they are for one specific candidate or for one specific nation state or one specific attack, right? So there is science behind this. And some of the information that we found was there are multiple different accounts that looked like bots based on clustering, based on analysis. It looked like it was a coordinated attack and a campaign. We saw that WikiLeaks, an account that was famous for releasing information about different nation states that was previously neutral, now changed and started tweeting things that were very, very interesting, to say the least, and specifically against one specific candidate, which was different from the way they used to react, right? They used to react against a specific nation and specific practices. And now, for the first time, shortly before elections, we saw WikiLeaks being leveraged for a political attack that was totally different from anything that they've done before, right? So that was weird. It was really, really weird, right? And we started tracking all this different information, and then some of the conclusions, after people questioned WikiLeaks, messages were sent to their timelines, or they were bombarded with tweets that were saying, "We're going to kill you," sort of like the stuff that you noticed. You know, "You're stupid, and this is your personal information, and we found out where you live," and all that kind of stuff. It was really, really weird, and it still goes on today. So we were now compromised, so they were publishing that type of information, and it looked a lot like hybrid warfare. Does anyone know what hybrid warfare is? Right? So hybrid warfare, does anyone not know? Raise your hand. Yes? Everyone else knows. Okay. So hybrid warfare is using different technologies and different aspects to further the forces of a specific nation state, right? So whether that's disinformation, whether it's fake news, whether it's basically breaking into systems, posing as the person that you broke into to make it look like someone that's respected is tweeting something totally different from what they usually tweeted, that kind of stuff. So it's using different channels of attacks that are not associated to classical warfare, but it still belongs in warfare, right? So WikiLeaks and news, that type of information that we've seen, and we've never seen this happen before. Ow. So getting back to the information, new users appeared like crazy previous to the election. After the election, it's like somebody pressed a button and thousands of these accounts were gone from one day to the next. Right? So when you see stuff like this, these different types of signs, then you try to come to a conclusion. Well, why did these accounts disappear, right? What kind of accounts disappeared? Why did it happen so quickly, right? So, and you correlate it to specific events. After it was clear that a specific candidate would win, many of these accounts that were basically bombarding and attacking anyone that had anything to say against a specific candidate, they disappeared, right? So then we started collecting manual data again about the rest of the specific users. We captured timelines of these hundreds of accounts before they disappeared, and then compared it to new accounts that popped up about a month after this happened, and we started to see connections emerging again, right? And that's when we started doing some more homework. So during all this time for the Twitter piece, there was also a coordinated attack that was going on during Election Day. So during Election Day, we took a look at an initial attack of over 12,000 IPs that were attacking specific areas. Some of the things that they were attacking, they came from different countries. It wound up being around 500,000, around 500,000 different IPs later on, right? So, you got the picture? Yeah. Okay. So, the information on this attack was interesting, though. So, does anyone remember the DDoS attack that happened previously to the election? We had an attack, botnet-based attack that was, I believe, 1.2 terabyte, right? This attack was different. We didn't even have 1 terabyte. We had around 600 megs a second that were going on, and then some of the we had a lot of new infections that were going on, and I'll get to in a minute some of the code so you guys can see that as well. So the infections happened very quickly, and they also used different ports than previous attacks, right? And they came in waves of around 30, 35 to 45 seconds, right? They continuously got worse, right, as the day went on. But it never went over 6 gigs, and it started with around 12,000 attackers and infectors. The botnet itself was really cool. So it did use DDoS, and it started attacking, you can't really see it that well here, a lot of the states that weren't sure where they were going to vote. And is it a conclusion? I can only report on the data that we found, but it was kind of curious, right? And what's even more curious is what they targeted. They had targeted systems like level 3, I'm not sure if I have the other ones in here. No. Like level 3, telecom, T-Mobile, AT&T, Verizon, all these different telecommunications companies. Does anyone know why that could be relevant for election day? Anyone? An idea?
Can you vote online?
Vote online is one thing, right, but then how do they send the data? When the voting machine is done.
They wouldn't. They would just stop people from voting online.
Right, but each individual voting area sends its data out to a central area in each state. How do they send it out? So if you disrupt communications, you can disrupt the flow of information, right? Interesting. So it looks like a botnet. You automatically think, well, maybe it's a script kiddie or someone else, because the last attack was actually an activist group. It wasn't a nation state, the 1.2 terabyte. And by the way, with around 400 to 500,000 clients, you can easily create an attack of over 3-4 terabytes, which means you can knock out most countries. You don't need 1 million, right? A lot of this the stuff that some people were reporting, millions of accounts, it's BS. You don't need that many. You need like 300, 400,000, and you can turn off a country just like that, right? So anyway, that was this. But I was asking questions. I mean, since this is a different attack, what was, is it a coincidence? What was the actual goal, right? You keep on asking yourself the question so you can collect evidence to find out what exactly was going on, right? So then we started to see connections going back to Russia, to China, and also internally in the US. And then we asked ourselves, was it a group or was it a nation? And why was it not the same DDoS attacks? Because we had malinformed packets. They were different attacks than the typical straightforward DDoS attacks that we saw in the previous attack, right? So it was interesting. When we took a look at the infector, we basically saw that it was going out on port 57982 and hitting 7547. Does anyone know what that port is used for? 7547? Anyone? 7547 is a DSL modem communication port. So how many of you have DSL connections at home? Raise your hands. Okay. What kind of boxes do you have at home? Okay. So here's the code, and I posted it on my Twitter timeline where you could find the code for research purposes to take a look at it, right? Interesting piece of code. It basically looks at what ports communicates, find out if the management port on your modem is open. When it's open, it sends an infection, basically that also circumvents a few different things on the system itself. It also looks for specific hard-coded passwords, and if it finds the password, then it can do its magic, right? So after that modem has been pwned, it can be used as a member of the botnet, or it can be used as a sub-infector for another group, right? So, and that's what we were seeing, what was going on. To give you an idea of some of those numbers, Comcast America, 10.9 million. Mexico, 6.3 million. United Kingdom, 3.7 million. India, Egypt, etc. So, and we were seeing these attacks going on with this protocol, right? So I want to take a look at who's communicating on port 7547 and what protocol is it. That's the management protocol, right? And these are a subset. There's a lot more, but these are a subset of those modems that we found, right? So, interesting. We had a botnet that was using a communication management protocol to infect, and also to include those infected DSL modems into a specific attack. Interesting, huh? Or maybe not. So with that, collecting data, data is equal to evidence. So collecting data about the risks that is neutral, collecting data about what types of breaches that are out there, collecting data from different crawlers, etc. That basically slipstreams into a system that I basically built for that, which looks like this. So we have the cloud piece, which is that one server I showed you guys before. We have sensors that are collecting that information. They go into a GUI. We have automation, AI, and self-defense. So basically, we're using neural networks to detect attacks, learn from every attack, and then to suggest the methods to defend against those attacks, right? Bayesian networks, neural networks, it's open source stuff, right? So then we have some of our own magic and code that goes into that, and we provide appliances or virtual machines in order to detect and stop these attacks. Some of the information that we're collecting now about nation-state actors, attacks, and everything else is IoT, sorry about the formatting, IoT here, so air-gap devices, IoT production and smart devices, critical infrastructure devices, communication and DSO modems, we saw some of that before. And then we have the classical piece, which is risk intelligence, social media, attack servers, specifically botnets, command and control servers and centers, and then specific other threat actors, and then also the information at home, what attacks are going on, right? So what